Hello everyone. So this will be a short tutorial, or maybe not that short actually, about how you make an asset like this in Dreams. So I made this wooden panel yesterday and I got quite good response online, and I had several of you ask about the techniques that I used to make this piece. So let's take a deeper look at that. So several of you also asked about the thermometer usage of an asset like this, and even though in the example scene it was a bit high, it's very easy to optimize the asset and get it all the way down to only around 2 or 3% thermometer. And as you can see, when you get up close, it looks a little bit rough. But as soon as you get a little bit away from the asset, it actually looks really good. And you can go nuts and add a lot of copies of this to your scene without it affecting the overall performance of the scene very much. So the graphics thermometer is not going to increase when you make copies or clones like this, but you will see an increase in the gameplay thermometer at some point. And the gameplay thermometer is actually it's affected by the overall amount of items in your scene. So that is all the clay strokes, all the paint strokes, all your logic, etc, etc. All of that is gonna influence the gameplay thermometer. So as you see here, as I'm increasing the amount of copies to a pretty insane amount, you can see that the gameplay thermometer is steadily increasing, and I'm gonna hit a limit here when I go in and copy all of these. You see now I'm all the way up to around 70% of gameplay thermo. So I made a new scene and I go in and turn on the grid snap. I then go into the kaleidoscope in the guides and I set the number to 4 kaleidoscopic repeats here. And I then place a stamp in the middle of my sculpt, and I move stamps out like this. The reason for this is that the first stroke in your scene is gonna, or the first stroke in your sculpt is gonna define the middle point of your mirror and your kaleidoscope. So even if I go in and delete the point here, the middle will still be in the same exact position. I then go in with the square clay tool and I stamp down the basic frame of the wood panel that I'll be making, and I make sure to place this in the middle of my kaleidoscope. Once that's done, I go in and I change the shape of the clay square, and as you can see, I've turned on kaleidoscope. I then place the frame around the model here, and I just place it roughly where I need it to be. I then increase the detail of the grid and I move the elements into place. I then turn on the precise move and I rotate the frame slightly. And for this sped up part of the video, you'll see me struggling to try and get the outer shape of the model right. So I do this with a combination of add and subtract, and I often make the shape, and then after that I move the shape into place. And a very good tip here is that if you only press your right trigger very lightly, you'll be moving your model very slowly. So if you need to make very precise adjustments, just make sure to only press your trigger very lightly like this. You can see here that I slowly start to get the shape right, and now I'm adding the outer frame of the model, and I use the stretch tool to stretch the shape into the right position. And once that's done, I choose the sphere clay tool and I edit the shape properties to have this very thin shape here that I can use to make cuts into the model to make it look like pieces of wood that is being clipped together. I then add some cylindrical shapes to the inside of the frame, and I add a little bit of soft blending to these to make it look more integrated into the model. And you can see here I just place the shape roughly where I need it, and I then use the stretch tool to stretch the shape after the fact. Now that I'm satisfied with the overall shape of the frame, it's time to scope out of the model and add a new model. So I still have the kaleidoscope on, I enable grid, and I then try and find the center point of my previous sculpt. And this looks pretty okay. So I drag out the shape here like this to make sure that I keep the center point, and I delete the sculpt in the middle here. And I can then start doing the ornament itself using a combination of the various tools in the clay tool. I tweak the shape a bit and I add a section like this. I turn stay upright on, and I then slowly start to realize the ornament itself. I try out a few things that doesn't really work, and I then enter into the shape editor of the object, and I change the mode to this extrude mode, where I kind of flatten the shape all the way down until I'm left with this white outline of the shape. This will allow you to very easily go in and extrude shapes out of the model like this, and it's a very quick way to build up volume for your model. So you can see here I'm starting to realize the pattern, and we'll just speed through this process. So basically you can tell it's just a matter of me kind of stamping in a shape using the kaleidoscope and then moving that shape after I stamp it down. So all in all, a very quick way to make ornaments like this, and also a very fun way to go about and work with stuff like this. So the model itself is finished now, and we can start adding some color. So I go into the first model we made, and I choose the sphere tool and set it to spray paint mode. I then pick a fitting color, either through the colors you can select up here, or through the color wheel that you can open up by bumping I think it's the right controller towards the left controller's button. So that will open up the quick color wheel for you, and you can then go in and start to add some fitting local colors. And I really recommend you go online and find some references for stuff like this, because even though you might think you know how a wooden panel looks like, I'm pretty sure you'll be surprised just how it really looks. So as you can tell, I've kept the kaleidoscope mode on, and I switch this on and off a little bit as I go along. I also add a spotlight here to better see my model. The lighting, default lighting, is a little bit too subtle, I think. I then go in and I select a gray dark color here, and start adding in some dust that's collecting in all the places that you imagine dust would kind of like settle down on a piece of architecture like this. So I turn off up or down the soft blend of the color, and also use the opacity to get a more subtle effect. And then it's basically just a matter of going in and coloring. And at some point you're gonna want to turn off the kaleidoscope and the mirror effect to not get too much of a repetitive look on your model. So again, I'm gonna jump into speed mode here, and you can just, you know, watch as the color is applied. So once I'm done with the first model, I scope into the ornament itself, and I use the same colors for this one, and make sure that all the wood grains or the veins of the wood follow the same direction, as an ornament like this would probably be carved from one piece of wood. I then scope out of the model, and I open the material properties of both elements. And to make things easier for us when we're tweaking the properties, we can link up the various ports here that we'll be tweaking, the waxiness and metalness and the roughness of the model. If we link those up, when I make changes to one, these changes will be reflected on the other one, and this can be especially helpful if you have a model with a lot of different sub-elements in it. So I changed the reflective properties of the model a bit until I get something that looks a bit like my reference. And then I go in and add a little bit more dust and grime to the model itself. For this I use the cone brush and I kind of paint from inside the model and out. After the coloring is done, I go in and I add a little bit of I add some ridges to the model like this by using a very flat and thin clay sphere. See here, I drag it out very far, and then I go in and add a little bit of imperfection to the wood. Now it's time to add a little bit of detail, and we can do that using the paint tool and the draw flex function. So I go in and I turn on the surface snap, and then I can just drag these veins, individual veins of the wood along the surface of the model, and this will give a nice amount of variation in the model, and also kind of like imply a higher detail level than what you actually have in the model. So this means that you can use the sculpture detail to optimize the model a lot, and then you can go in and add a little bit of extra detail using paint strokes like this. But you should definitely try and limit yourself with this, because what you need to remember is that each individual action you take in Dreams adds to the thermometer use. So if you go nuts with these brush strokes, it's eventually it's gonna cost something in the thermometer. So just add enough for it to look interesting, and then keep it at that. Now it's time to check out if we can optimize or improve the details without too high impact on the thermometer. So make sure the thermometer is enabled, and then using the sculpture detail tool, you can go in and experiment with either increasing or decreasing the amount of detail on your model. So this, I think this looks pretty good, and we are only at 2% graphics here, which is very nice, I think, for a detailed asset like this. So let's take a look at what this looks like if we go in and repeat the asset and set it up for like a beauty shot of the asset. So first off, I go in and I save the asset out as a new creation, and this will enable me to, once I've duplicated the element, I can always go in and I can edit the source object and have that edit be reflected across all my copies. Alright, so using the precise move tool in the guides section, I go in and I make clones of my object here. Once you make clones like this, you'll notice that the thermometer doesn't change, at least not noticeably. So clones doesn't take up additional graphics thermometer. They will increase the gameplay thermometer usage. So if you get like hundreds of copies of this element, you're gonna see some impact on the gameplay thermo. But almost like magic, the graphics thermometer doesn't increase at all. So I think this is a very impressive amount of optimization that the guys at Media Molecule has done in the game or in the program. So now it's time to go in and change the light a bit and set up the beauty shot of our scene here. So I move the spotlight and I change its shape to increase the strength of the light, and I then go in and duplicate the light a bit. I also add a bluish light in the back like this, and I turn down its brightness a lot. This just adds a little bit of ambient color, which gives a nice look to the overall scene. I add a sun and sky gadget, and I go in and tweak the lights here until I find something that I think looks good. So as I change the settings here, one thing you should notice though is that the fog range under the sky settings here is an important thing to change if you want your viewing distance to be better in Dreams. So I go in and I add a Grade and Effects gadget as well, and in here I'll be able to change things like I can add more sharpness to the scene, I can add motion blur, I'll be able to add a vignette, etc, etc. So I add a camera, I open its camera settings, I also open up the Grade and Effects settings, and I can then jump into the camera and tweak all the settings from here and see exactly what my finished image will look like. I then open the light properties of the bluish light here, and I add a image overlay to the light source. This will add a nice amount of variation in the light and make it look a little bit more natural, I think. So I tweak the light until I find something that I like here, and I also change the beam angle, the fade angle of the light, and overall just play around with the settings until I get a fitting result. I then scope into the camera, and from in here I can change the Grade and Effects and the camera settings. First thing though, I'll want to add some depth of field to my image, so I go in and change the aperture size of the camera. And as you can tell, I need to change the focus distance of the camera, and I find that this is most easily done through exiting the camera and then manually moving the focus point. And as you can see here, the focus is now spot on. So we're gonna speed through this process, but I generally just tweak the vignette, the sharpness of the image. I tweak the bloom, and I also sometimes add some color tint through this menu here. I also add some chromatic aberration, as I think that gives a nice effect. But that's about it for this asset. I really hope you enjoyed watching this process, and I hope you learned something from it. I'm very impressed with this software, and I can't wait to see what's going to be created in just, a year from now. I think we'll be seeing some really amazing stuff. We already have a lot of very great stuff in the Dreamyverse, and it's a fun thing to be part of, I think. But anyways, I look forward to seeing your work in the Dreamyverse, and I'll be back with more tutorials at a later point. Thanks for watching.